Washington Journal continues.
Leslie Harris, this week you participated in a hearing on something called data mining. What do we mean by that?
Well, we mean a number of things by data mining. Data mining is the use of technology to look at large databases of information in order to try to find a pattern, something predictive, and in this case, predictive of possible terrorism or criminal activity. That's one meaning. It's the meaning that we were discussing at the hearing. There are lots of uses for data analysis, for going through large databases when you already have a criminal suspect, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about going through large databases of information, often that include the personal day-to-day activities of law-abiding American citizens, looking for a pattern that somehow might indicate activity to be concerned about.
How many branches of the federal government are involved in this?
A lot. A lot. I mean, there have been some recent reports to suggest, now not all of these are anti-terrorism, but that there could be 120 or more different data mining programs going on, not all of concern. I mean, that kind of predictive data mining is used in the commercial sector. I mean, it's, you know, when you get a call from your credit card company and they say, there's a pattern that we're disturbed about, we want to make sure these are your purchases, that is predictive data mining. They've developed an algorithm based on years of looking at what fraudulent activity. It's done automatically and they call you, but they're doing it based on a pretty long factual history of fraud. So in programs that have a potential for fraud in the federal government, you know, they may be using similar techniques, but those are not the ones that concern us.
Who does oversight into how this information is being sought out?
Well, I think that's part of the concern. I mean, depending on the agency, different substantive committees plus appropriators have oversight responsibility, but very little information has been given to Congress on these programs, and at least until Senator Leahy held the hearing the other day, the pattern has been somebody leaks a program to the press, total information awareness, secure flight. Congress seems as surprised as the rest of us that those programs are going on. There are hearings, there are investigations, there are efforts to put some procedural safeguards around those programs.
Ultimately, what does Senator Leahy want to see out of all this as far as oversight?
Well, I think that there are a number of things that need to happen. First of all, we shouldn't be doing this kind of predictive data mining unless we know it's effective. And there's not a lot of evidence that it's effective. I'm willing to be open. I don't think that data mining is like per se evil or good. But each program needs to be assessed for effectiveness. If it's not identifying terrorists, stopping terrorists, then we ought not to be sucking up the, you know, the information of Americans. If it's, so the first thing is that we've got to get some transparency in these programs. We have to get real oversight. And Senator Feingold and Sununu, Leahy and others introduced a bill this week that I think is an important first step, because it would require each of these programs to file detailed reports with Congress, not just on what they're doing, but on the showings of effectiveness, the privacy protections that are in place, the laws they believe apply, the laws they think they don't apply. So that's job number one.
And there's, as to date, there's no real evidence as far as saying this program or this type of data mining produces evidence on, you know, X number of terrorists that we've been able to apprehend?
I think the answer is no. I mean, at this hearing, there were, you know, a number of proponents of this kind of data mining. They were not able to say, we know this is effective. And there was also Jim Harper from the Cato Institute, who had done, I thought, a very compelling study that the problem with trying to apply that kind of data mining here is, I mean, you know, when you're trying to find fraud in your credit card, you're developing a pattern based on millions, if not billions, of transactions. To try to identify a pattern that terrorists engage in, we don't have enough cases, and they're not consistent enough to be able to do that. So there's a lot of evidence that it's not. But as I said, you know, somebody needs to come forward and show the Congress that a particular program is effective. If it's not effective, then Congress shouldn't let them do it. And then if they do let them do it, then we've got to confront the fact that we have not updated and looked at our privacy protections since the advent of this sort of new digital data environment.
Our guest is with us till 10 o'clock, and you can ask her questions about the government searches for personal information. The lines on your screen, they all start with a 202 area code, and please pick the line that best represents you. Before we go to calls,
Sure.
What would you recommend as far as
Well,
oversight?
I think, you know, obviously they ought to pass this legislation and conduct very vigorous oversight about these programs. If things are classified, they know how to conduct those hearings as necessary. 2, they need to prohibit the programs that are not working, that they can't prove effectiveness. We have to get our arms around the use of commercial databases. One of the reasons that we have very little privacy protection is that we passed the Privacy Act. It's now, you know, shocking to me, you know, well over 30 years ago. One of 2 things is happening. Privacy Act is the law that says to the government, when you have personal information, here's how you handle it, here's how people correct it, here's how you share it. By going to commercial databases and essentially reaching in, not bringing that data into the government, they completely bypass the Privacy Act. So you're going through commercial data. You don't have to show that that data is accurate. You don't have to tell people that you're going through that data. So the first thing is we've got to apply Privacy Act-like protections so that you can't circumvent that. We have to look at the whole range of laws that were intended to protect privacy, the cases that were decided before we you know, moved into this era. But those are some of the, I think, initial steps that need to be taken.
Leslie Harris is the Executive Director of the Center for Democracy and Technology. The first call is Bloomfield, Colorado.
Oh, Ms. Harris, good morning. I think you have done a pretty good and objective job of covering both sides of the debate. To give you a bit of a background, I'm a foreign national. I've been living in the U.S. for the last 6 years now. I was initially taken in about this hype and hoopla about privacy in the U.S., which I really think is basically a joke. The moment an American or anybody else walks into a supermarket, that person's buying habits are monitored from the moment they enter to the moment they actually use the product. You also have commercial companies, credit rating agencies that know every bit of my financial data, whether I like it or not. I just don't understand why we set a separate standard for the government, considering the fact that this intrusion of privacy is almost an accepted fact in daily American life.
Right. Well, I mean, I think you've touched on what's a very interesting point, which is, and this goes to this question of commercial data and sort of how we're no longer really able to draw a strong line between those two. First of all, we don't have a uniform privacy law in the United States applying to the commercial sector, which of course you do have in Europe and in many other places. But at least in the commercial sector, you do have sector-specific privacy laws. There's a Fair Credit Reporting Act. There's bank privacy laws. There's health privacy laws. Shockingly, we have more privacy protection in the commercial realm than we do for data in the government realm. Overall, I think that we need to get our arms around the just proliferation of these databases on both sides, the commercial and the government, because the line between them is fast disappearing. But you're correct. We have a Fourth Amendment in our Constitution, and how it is being interpreted and what its viability is in the modern era, I think is at some risk.
New York City.
Yeah, good morning. Couple quick things. I was hoping, as far as the privacy interests and the privacy protections, you would address from what I understand, that much of this data mining is at least initially computer done,
right.
And before anyone's privacy is actually invaded by another human being, some sort of red flag has to go up. So I was hoping you would cover a little bit of that and whether you think those protections are adequate. And secondly, not to throw out a somewhat obvious argument, but you also discussed that these data mining programs need to prove effective before we go ahead with them.
Right.
How would you respond to the argument that the tragedies of 9/11 were proof that not doing them was entirely ineffective to protect us, and that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and that Where
Right.
would you draw the line between the two? And
Well-
I'm curious to hear your answers on
Well,
both.
let me start with your last question, because I agree with you completely, and I think that that is a materially different form of data mining, and I think that this debate in some large part is confused because all of these things are data analysis and data mining. With respect to 9/11, the data mining that they may have done there, or what we're calling data mining, they had people on watch lists that they were not able to track here. They had information about people who were involved in Al-Qaeda meetings. Connecting the dots, what we would call link analysis between known suspects and others who may share an address or share a... That is not the kind of data mining that I'm talking about here. The government ought to engage in that kind of data mining. It's overly simplified, but call that suspicion-based or suspect-based. Of those 9/11 perpetrators, you had a variety of information that could have been linked up among them using databases. So on that front, I agree with you completely, but we should not get these two things confused. On your former point, yes, what we're talking about largely is taking these databases and running a sort of some kind of an algorithm through them so that everybody's data is sucked up, but possibly only some people's data is then pulled out for further analysis. And I think that the question here is, when does that become a search? Is at some point it has to be a search. If it's not, then the Fourth Amendment, I think, has been rendered meaningless. I would argue that it is a search from the moment your data is collected, and some level of protection needs to apply, and that certainly once they start to focus on you, then I see that I see no question that at that point a warrant is required, and the normal criminal procedure ought to apply as well. I think there was some other part to your question, but I admit
We'll take another call.
I've lost it.
Aora, Colorado.
Yes, good morning. I
morning.
have 2 points. Number one, the absolute last person who I'd like to see oversighting this situation is Senator Leahy, who, if I recall correctly, was actually thrown off the Intelligence Committee in the Senate because of his leaking. And number two, that's the last thing we need, is to have all our intelligence collectors and analysts absolutely bogged down with writing detailed reports on this thing so that it can be picked apart by any little senator who's running for Congress, or running for the presidency, or feels that he should be president. And I'll stand by and listen to your comment. Thank you.
Well, I just think this is a situation where we disagree. We are, in just several weeks ago, it was revealed for the first time that massive amounts of information on the travel habits of Americans were being collected into a database that the government was holding for 40 years, applying risk scores that would stay with you for your life. That's something Congress ought to know about. There's nothing that suggests that the national security area is one that should not have oversight. And indeed, given the complexities of terrorism and the fact that we have taken down the wall between investigations for counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and crime, the need for that oversight is even more critical. So I just fundamentally disagree with you. I agree with you that the analysts shouldn't be sitting around writing silly little reports, but we have no adequate privacy protections in place for lawful American citizens. And I think what people need to understand, and this may go back to this question of the information coming in the database, is that once the government has that information, it's theirs for any purpose that they want. So we're not necessarily, so even if you're in an initial database and that database, you haven't been pulled out for some reason, the way most of these laws are being applied, your personal information then can be shared all over the government, and now the Justice Department is going to be setting up something called, I think it's One DOJ or One Justice, which will share it all the way back down. So you do have to be concerned that decisions are going to be made about people with no procedural protections, based on data that you have no right to correct. So I don't think we're asking for anything particularly radical here. People ought to be able to, if there's an adverse decision that's wrong, there ought to be a way that you can go to correct the information. There ought to be a way to go to challenge that information. I mean, those are basic American protections, and I don't think that most of us want to suddenly become a different country, and we're fast becoming a different country. And again, I want to point out, I'm not saying never do this. I'm not saying, that there may not be a time, assuming we can someday prove the effectiveness of these programs, that we shouldn't use them. But of course there has to be oversight.
Easley, South Carolina.
Good morning, C-SPAN. There's a question, and there's a point that needs to be made here also. We can pass lots of laws protecting data and all that, and the government is using a lot of these private databases for mining. But also, a lot of these databases have been moved offshore, well beyond any kind of jurisdiction of U.S. law. I'm sorry, I got my TV turned down. You're shaking your head. But from what I have been told, these are all sitting in a lot of this stuff has been moved to other countries. We can pass lots of laws saying, hey, we need to protect our private data, but if it's sitting in another country, there's nothing we can do about it. And I just wondered about your comment.
Well, I think that depends on the circumstance. I mean, I understand, and I have been hearing the same things, that the commercial databases in particular have been, like everything else, offshored. But when our government uses data, whether, regardless of where they're obtaining the data, the American laws apply. It is, somewhat more complicated with respect to private entities, but when private entities use personal data in the United States, wherever that data is sitting, our laws apply. I think the greater concerns have to do with security and data breach, which is a big problem, a separate big problem in the commercial sector, and the fact that we may be shipping these databases into places where there's a lot of criminal activity, a lot of fraud, and not a lot of strong security protections.
There's a profile this morning of the Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. What does this effort by Senator Leahy mean for him and information that's gained by the Justice Department in their investigation of things?
Well, again, I think it depends. I think that information that is developed by the Justice Department, using, linking analysis, a variety of techniques where you're looking in databases for links based on a suspicion. And I'm not saying probable cause. I'm saying a suspicion. You are developing a case. You are following a suspect. Is a different matter than simply developing a hypothesis going through the personal information of I can't overestimate the number of people who are probably being sucked up into these databases. And the fact that once they have this information, it isn't like they throw it all away. And I think that that's what people don't understand. In the controversy last year about the warrantless wiretapping, which may well have been a sort of sucking information out in an effort to look at find specific information, it doesn't all go in a trash can. It then becomes available for sharing, at least with other law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and the way they've been exempting themselves from the Privacy Act, perhaps a lot further than that.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for Leslie Harris.
Thank you. I have two ideas that I'd like you to comment on. The first one is probably within the past year, I read an article that said government, United States government, federal, state, and local levels are the leading cause of identity theft. Okay? And the second idea that I'd like you to comment on is that using non-approved techniques to mine data about individuals,
right.
Couldn't that result in just a generally poor quality database? Thank you.
Yes, let me start with the latter. The poor quality database question is a very serious one, and it's one of the reasons we originally had a Privacy Act, so that when the information was wrong, people could correct it. using commercial databases, the quality is often very poor. And so you have the potential for wrong decisions based on poor data, and you also have the possibility of wrong decisions based on developing algorithms that create enormous numbers of false positives. And that's a very big concern in this kind of a data environment, because then with the false positives, we haven't developed a procedure for people to get themselves out once they've been wrongly identified. I really can't comment on your first point. I mean, data breach is a serious concern. Obviously, we've had breaches in Veterans Fairs, a number of other places that suggest that the government is at least certainly has a role in the identity theft problem, but I have no information to be able to say it's more so than the commercial sector.
What is the Center for Democracy and Technology?
What are we?
Yeah.
We are a civil liberties organization committed to assuring that the new technologies build democracy and free expression. It's been around for 10 years. A combination of lawyers and technologists who believe in technology. I mean, I think it's very important. We're not a Luddite organization. We're an organization that embraces and believes that technology has a very important role. At the same time, we understand that to build this medium so that it has real value for all aspects of American life globally, to really transform societies, that we have to have the right legal frameworks in place. And at least on this issue, we just have not stopped to look at what's happened to our Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, what's happened to our laws before we've moved forward.
How are you funded?
We're funded from a variety of sources. We get more than half our money probably from foundations. Technology companies give us a fair amount of money. Law firms come to our dinners. Sometimes we get money from Cypre Awards from courts when there are privacy violations. It's a mix.
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I had a couple of questions. One was, why is it that people chose to believe that the Total Information Agency was an okay thing from the beginning? How is it the average person talks themselves into thinking it's okay if the government has your information, knowing that there's a lot of people out there who get government jobs because they don't really want to work all that hard? And are you taking any action on the fact that the DNA chain is being bought up by corporations as it becomes unraveled? Was my other question. And also, what is the instance of having the information collected by government employees end up in the hands of the criminal element, like a Dun & Bradstreet listing for crime?
Well, that's a lot of questions. Let me just say this about total information awareness. The fact is that there was an extraordinary public uproar about the TIA program and the way it was described. Congress came back and prohibited that program. The result of that, unfortunately, was that it was simply moved into another agency, further into a black box, so that we can't supervise it. The only thing that I would say, and it's not in defense, is that pure research, both on the technologies of predictive data mining and on the potential for there to be privacy technologies that would allow you to do data minings in ways that protect information, ought to go on. But Congress ought to know what's going on in that event. Best I can tell, and there's been some very good articles, TIA continues apace, but I think it continues as a research program at this point.
Fairmont, Texas. Fairmont, Texas.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I believe earlier you said that before you should be allowed to start a data mining, you have to prove its effectiveness. Of course, if I haven't started it, I can't prove its effectiveness. I understand if it's not effective, we should quit doing it. But how do I get Congress to approve some idea that may or may not be ultimately effective?
I think you test it. I mean, you ought to be allowed to use, scrub data and test a program. And then you ought to, and then you have to look at whether once you deploy that program, assuming the initial testing is promising. I mean, I think those are policy decisions that Congress and the executive branch need to make. I don't think the answer is a program has to be perfect. But if testing shows something is promising and then you start that program, then you have to closely look at it. I mean, if you've got a 99.9% false positive rate, well, you may decide it's not effective, or maybe that 1/10 of 1% is critically important. If that's the case, then you've got to figure out what are you going to do for the 99.9% of times that you're wrong. What's the process for getting people, out of the classification? So, I don't think that asking for effectiveness is a wrong thing to do. Again, effectiveness does not mean 100% of the time. It doesn't mean perfect. It means, is it worth deploying this? Are we likely to get information that's going to help protect the country?
One more call from Princeton, New Jersey. Good morning.
Yes, I'm a mathematician, which is probably not too surprising since I'm from Princeton. And I'm retired now, but for the last 20 years of my career, I worked at a research institute which did mathematics of cryptology for NSA.
Right.
And the problem there is sort of similar to the problem that you're talking about. We have gobs of data, and we're looking for a pattern in it.
Right.
Now, we didn't know the pattern. Like in the credit card case, they know what patterns they're looking for. In our case, we're just looking for any pattern, and it didn't work. In fact, there are mathematical arguments that show that in that case, data mining is never going to work. Okay? So the point is, if you have some idea of what you're looking for, you can find it. But
right.
If you don't have any idea of what you're looking for, which is the case in the government's programs and in our work on cryptology, it's not going to work. Okay? Let me just point out a couple of other things. In the past, we have had a president in recent past, in my lifetime, namely Richard Nixon, who did use these kind of things for nefarious purposes.
That's right.
And the second point I want to make is once you get it down to an individual, then it's easy to provide safeguards. It's easy to provide for warrants and all these things.
That's right.
And
yeah, no, I agree. I agree completely. And as I said, that what we lack here is the pattern at a level to be able to, put it in effect. And there hasn't been evidence, and there's been a lot of writing lately about the inability. All I'm saying is, if we're wrong, if they've now been able to figure out how to do this, then they should, come forward and tell somebody, and then we'll move forward. But until that time, we're putting everybody's rights in jeopardy.
Leslie Harris is the Executive Director for the Center for Democracy and Technology. Thank you for coming by.
Thank you so much.
Coming up on the Washington Journal tomorrow, we will talk about politics in our first 45-minute segment with Patricia Murphy of the American Interest Magazine. She's their executive editor, and Paul Mirengoff of PowerlineBlog.com. David Satterfield from the State Department will join us at 8:30 tomorrow to talk about Iraq. He is the coordinator for Iraq, and talk about the president's plan. At 9, we will start one of two issue segments looking at Latin America. The first looking at Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan economy and plans he has for the economy. And then Otto Reich will join us in our last half hour as we look at Daniel Ortega becoming the president once again of Nicaragua. The Washington Journal starts at 7 a.m. tomorrow, and we will see you then.
Next on C-SPAN, a Senate Homeland Security Committee hearing on the September 11th recommendations. Then House floor debates on 9/11 recommendations, minimum wage, stem cell funding, and the Medicare prescription drug plan. Now on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.